Morning Prime, holding court with Professor Peter Kagwanja, the CEO of Africa Policy Institute. Also, we have Dr. Hassan Kanenje, who is the director at the Horn Institute. Also, we have with us Ahmed Hashi, a governance and policy analyst, and Dr. Professor Simeon Sungi, who is professor at USIU Criminal Justice. That is where he professes. Is it right to say you're professing?
That's where
Does a professor profess?
Yeah.
He is professing.
You profess knowledge.
You profess knowledge.
Yeah. But I think the means of doing that has changed. In our classes, if you come to my class,
Yes.
I will not profess.
What you do?
I will let my students contribute, and I will moderate like exactly what you're doing here.
So professing is sort of a jargon mag theory.
Yeah,
Where you are imparting knowledge.
No,
I don't have the other side of the student participating, isn't it?
There was something called expository lecture, where
Expository lecture, yes.
where you came fully clad in your academic regalia, and you stood there with an assistant who would normally be what you call a tutorial fellow, and you talk for a full hour, where you expect nobody even to raise a finger or even blink. You talk and then walk out without saying anything. Then you leave the class for discussion. That is what we are calling tutorial sessions.
Tutorial sessions.
Now, tutorial sessions is where you can raise your questions and all. But many professors will not come for those tutorial sessions.
So the tutorial well was a sort of an aid camp behind you while you're professing.
It's like the boys. What were they called? The boys in the church.
Oh yeah, the ushers, like
yes, they would help the
priests to
yes.
distribute
Yeah.
I assume we're on
sacrament and all that stuff.
Yeah. So that was it. No, he asked for a very
Well,
serious issue for explanation.
I told her she just let me moderate. Yeah, I have the leeway to actually deflect on the subject. Yeah, so please, you want to really contribute on al-Shabab. So let's start with you.
You know, it's a reason why I'm very gung-ho about it is because they have attacked me personally. Remember, Deval, I was in the show a long time ago on another network, and they had sent some boys to my house because I was one of the first people. Remember when we were in another station where we talked about how we need to use intelligence, how we so forth and so on. Deval, I want to suggest to the panel and to use that I think the discourse that we have about terror shouldn't be the discourse we have about drugs. So they just don't use it. Remember Nancy Reagan? You remember the South American Contras? You remember how this whole discourse of drugs was constructed by the White House. And finally, after years of problematic issues, it came out that the war on drugs was an operation by the CIA that was dealing with politics in South America. Now, I find about that we're paying attention to the discourse of the militarization of al-Shabab, or the fight against it is spoken in terms of the military, in terms of artillery, in terms of tanks, in terms of our defense secretary going on a spending spree. The ordinary Somalis are picking up ideas by sticks, and getting rid of it at a rate more than any other mechanical equipment. For me, it is not a priority to have these kind of trucks. Especially in this country, in the situation that we're in. Spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of shillings on these vehicles is a scandal, Demal, in my view. The reason is that in Somalia today, Demal, I met two leaders from Somalia yesterday, Garad Mukhtar and Garad Chama from Las Anod. The civil institutions in Somalia are the ones that are going to defeat the al-Shabab. The people of Somalia are the ones who are going to defeat the al-Shabab. It is not the Kenya Defense Forces. It is not the AU. It is not IGAD. It is not fighter jets. It's the people of Somalia. When I met these two traditional leaders, there was a conflict between them and the administration in Hargeisa, led by Colonel Musa Behi. In Garowe yesterday, there was a firefight in the middle of the city because of the people demanding their right to have a constitutional government in Puntland. And the allegations are that former leaders are using clans to destabilize the civil authority. In Kismayo, there is no civil authority. In Mogadishu, the civil authority is not there. If we don't build the civil authorities, the Shabaab are going to run amok. The ball, you know that the men and women in Somalia called the Ma'awislayal. Ma'awislayal, as you know, Nikikoi. It's the Kikoi, the Somali language. Have stood up and pushed the al-Shabab all the way now to Kismayo. The reason why we're seeing an upsurge of Shabab in Mandera, in Lagdera, in places like that, is because that the people are fighting these men and women with AK-47s. We in Kenya have to support something called the civil authority. We have to stop and take a deep breath and say, where are the public institutions that are being built in Somalia vis-a-vis their fight against the Shabaab? The war against the Shabaab is a moral war. It's about the ideas of good over evil. And that is won by the moral persuasion in which the people take up the mantle of their own defense. And Debal, I feel that the institutions that were built in Somaliland, the institutions that were built in Puntland, in Jubaland, are now under threat because the leadership there, Debal, doesn't understand the overwhelming problem of the Somali crisis. What they do understand is, as our own politicians here, to stay into power and to get resources from it. Second, the technological revolution in the world today does not necessarily say that we should buy these massive trucks at a cost that is just out of the reach of this country. What it says is that we need drones. We need a more professional military. We need a military that understands how to deal with the civil issues in a community or in a village. For example, the KDF runs healthcare in Kismayo. If I give you a real example of it, the KDF runs these health centers for mothers with children. Now, Debal, the biggest information that the KDF gets is from these women, from the people in the community and in the village, because of the services that the KDF gives those people. It builds confidence. Creating a military situation there where you have only artillery and trucks, armored personnel carriers, is necessary. Nobody's saying it's not necessary, but it is secondary to the civil administration and to police and to the training of people who can get rid of IDP. The best people to get rid of those things are the local people, because they know the mentality of the terrorists. The terrorists are from these villages, from these hamlets. So I take my senior learner's points about intelligence, and I think that if we do that, I think that we will be able to defeat the al-Shabab in tandem with the Somali people. Lastly, I put it to you, Debal, that I think that the Cabinet Secretary for Defense needs to listen to some experts' view on how to deal with the issues around the military in Somalia. Because Debal, buying equipment is less important than buying the moral and political acceptance of the people.
Right. Yeah. All right, before we move on, I just want to update us so far on this resurgence of al-Shabab. Somalia's government says 43 al-Shabab militants, including 2 senior commanders, were killed by Somali National Army forces during a weekend airstrike about 14 kilometers from the Jamame district in the lower Juba region. The airstrike successfully eliminated key al-Shabab leaders, Eden Abdi Rahman, if we just run the clips, that is Abdi Rahman Eden, and Idris Abdi Rahim Nur, who was of Kenyan national origin. And it says, and a total of 43 al-Shabab fighters, the Somali National News Agency reported on Monday, that is SONA. And it says the attack carried out by Somalia's international partners happened on Friday as the militants and their commanders gathered to plan attacks against government soldiers at the Barsaguni military base, which is home to the Somali National Army and local forces. The statement did not specify the foreign partner that conducted the airstrike, but often U.S. Africa Command drones carry out attacks on Somali militant targets. Let me just hear here from Dr. Kanenje on this latest development and killing of their leaders as well.
I think to the extent that still you're having some of the senior al-Shabab, with Kenyan roots, tells us that the al-Shabab problem in Somalia is not just a Somali problem, it is our problem. These are people who have roots and networks here, and frankly, they do have some support, from here. And I want to agree with what both Prof and Hashi has mentioned. Intelligence is going to be very, very important. But it's not just about the intelligence by the state. It's also about the intelligence that the community has, and especially in working a way in which our communities can work a lot more closely with our government. Now, I don't think any of us is opposed to acquiring APCs. APCs are important in saving lives, especially for men and women in uniform, because conducting campaigns against al-Shabaab on a Land Cruiser, literally, you are a sitting duck. You're going to be destroyed. And that's going to be used as propaganda, for al-Shabaab. Like, look at how many we have destroyed. So ensuring there is a level of protection is important. But some of the works, for instance, that, KDF, for instance, and AMISOM and our ATMIS have done in Somalia in terms of winning hearts and minds, has been laudable, though not widely reported, especially, within the media and stuff like that. But perhaps we should triple our investment in things that can build capacities, but also win hearts and minds of populations. But ensure that communities have a buy-in, because anytime there's an IED, someone from the community knows.
Absolutely.
Someone from the community saw somebody, and someone from the community has kept quiet. And so this silence is actually what is destroying us. It is not the al-Shabaab itself. It is the extent to which our own citizens, sometimes, they are complicit and they're complacent when it comes to fighting the terror threat. Now, at a time when, for instance, right now Somalia is applying to join the East African community, their security problem is going to become ours, because that is going to require that we have a lot more open borders than we even have today. Now, how can we be able to extricate ourselves from that kind of situation? So a regional framework, of course, is going to be necessary. But Kenya is a frontier state. Kenya has a lot more interest in Somalia's stability, perhaps, than any other country in the region. And so are we prepared to do what we must do to ensure, that we build that kind of capacity to protect our borders, but also to ensure that Somalia is stable? You see, the continued existence of instability in Somalia has contributed to the kind of issues we have in Kenya today. And so even as we move forward, that is something we should, critically think about. But finally, one thing about Kenyans is we forget very quickly. And the moment we are living in relative safety, we actually don't want to invest in vigilance. And that is why on this program, we're always trying to call on Kenyans to remain vigilant all the time, because the war against terror is not going to be won just by the government. They are the government. It's going to be won by all of us.
Thank you. Right. Peter Kagwanja, let's wind up on it.
I want to make 3 points on this related to some of the views that have been raised here. One is that we must understand terrorism, whether it's al-Shabab or any other kind, as a continuation of the old guerrilla warfare in a more sophisticated way now. And in that context, understand that a terrorist or a guerrilla is like a fish in water. And the community in which the guerrilla operates is the water. Therefore, if you are going to drain the swamps, it is not a focus on technology and so on. It's a focus on understanding the community within which the terrorists operate. Now, what is making it difficult for al-Shabaab to operate in Somalia is because the government has decided to walk on its feet rather than its head, by focusing on local community as the basis of the war, rather than talking about alliances internationally. Yes, you need international support, you need regional support, but primarily the war is about Somalis. It's not about everybody else. So that idea of draining the swamp by understanding the community deeper is good. Second, we must round KDF because its operations in Somalia have been guided by that very principle, that let's win the hearts and minds, as Dr. Kali put it. We win the hearts and minds by doing what? Being on this humanitarian development nexus. And you build, you sink wells, build schools, kiss babies, and treat the mothers who are sick, and so on. But that kind of approach is what has won, KDF a lot of support in southern Somalia. But we need to deepen that in the sense of how do you empower local communities to fight al-Shabab themselves, so that even if you pulled out, the war against al-Shabab will continue. Finally, my focus now is on what is happening in the two areas, that is northern Kenya, the 3 of 7, 5 counties, depending
frontline counties.
Frontline counties, depending on who is counting. They might be 5 or 3, and Jubaland and Southwest. Now, when you look at that whole continent, ignoring the border as it were, you find that as Kenyans, particularly the securocracy, those in the security sector, actually don't understand the drivers of violence there. And that's why Jubaland is becoming such a difficult area to operate in. When you don't, and sometimes when you talk this, hear, oh, this, I'm Marehan, oh, I am Ogaden, oh, I am this, because clan and power is the pivot around which Somali politics revolves. And sometimes you find it that some clans prefer to work with al-Shabab than to fight al-Shabab because of their clan interests. Now, so if you cannot grasp the clan interests and reconcile them across that region, it's not about the military. It's not about the sophistication of the arms that we are acquiring. It is a sophistication of the knowledge that we are using to intervene to fight al-Shabab. And that is why it has become very, very difficult for us to move beyond Kismayu and 20 kilometers of its perimeter. So we are caged there. In Jubaland, that is where al-Shabab has its headquarters in Jibril. Why does it have its headquarters just a few kilometers from the Kenyan border, and our military has been there for now 10 years? It is because we have not mastered the knowledge of the anthropology and the ethnocracy of the politics there, which al-Shabab is using extremely well. A friend of mine from Somalia told me that the al-Shabab does not care to speak this language of the Somali. There are many dialects. There is this language which is not the typical Somali normally spoken in Southwest. That is the one they use. They use that dialect to communicate among themselves, meaning they are not going to be detected by the Kenyans or the Somali intelligence, or those who are doing all of that. It will be difficult to do that. So the point is, a lot of investment must go into understanding the dynamics of intra-clan politics, particularly in Jubaland and the outlying areas. That is why al-Shabab is very comfortable in northern Kenya, because it is riding on crime rivalries and the supremacy wars among the Somali clans. Because if it's the Ogaden who are advantaged, then their rivals will tend to use al-Shabab instrumentally to punish their enemies.
Right.
And then we think that we are fighting al-Shabab, but we're fighting al-Shabab and other clans. When you kill members of the other clans, what do? They now start saying that the Kenyan KDF is supporting certain rivals. Therefore, it becomes a very complex and murky situation. Let's invest in understanding the dynamics of our clan politics and work with those to ensure that the KDF remains very neutral. I once thought that we have 3 arms of the military: the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. I think we need another special force that is capable to fight guerrilla without going the way of Sudan. We need to fight away because
you're talking about the Wagner mercenaries as well.
No, not Wagner mercenaries. We
similar.
Yeah, not really. It is the rapid RCF.
Okay.
Yes, in Sudan, because.
But of course they began as a guerrilla first.
Omar al-Bashir, the Janjaweeds.
Yeah, the Janjaweeds, yeah.
Yes, but not the Janjaweed side. This is remember, Bashir controlled that force using the intelligence, and the command was with the army, and that is how they were able to deal with much of the rebellion in Darfur, in the Brunei, and in other places. There is no way you are going to defeat al-Shabab using the conventional army. No. They see your uniform 100 kilometers away.
But the question is also how long? So how long have we been fighting this al-Shabab? And why is there not a Somali state in Somalia today? This is an important question.
Thank you, Hashi. I just want to hear from Professor Sungi. But before we go there, could we just get a brief from the CS who was talking about the al-Shabab and how will not be intimidated while he was at Garissa County in Masalani. Let's listen in.
A serious modernization program, both for the National Police Service and for Kenya Defense Forces. We are ready and we are investing to buy equipment in the next 3 months that will help even deter the IEDs the terror groups are using. We are buying more sophisticated APCs. We will buy more other equipment in the war against terror. Kenya will never fall. We can never be intimidated by terrorists. We will not. Kama wewe ni chief, unakaa station yako. Kama wewe ni DO, unakaa station yako. Kama wewe ni mfanyikazi wa serikali, hata ukiwa uluko, utakaa uluko. Mambo ya security sisi tutalinda, lakini kama wafanyikazi wa serikali wenyewe hawakai station yao, wanatoroka, kwani mnawachia station sababu wakae? Every government official must stay in the location, in the sub-location, in the division, in the sub-county. He has been told and has been posted as a government public official.
Right, CS Defense there, warning also the government officers or security officers to be on standby in their stations with this resurgence of al-Shabab. I was to just hear from you, Professor Sungi.
Yes, so I don't want to contradict CS Duale, but I think I really agree. I agree with what Brother Hashi observed, that this so-called war on terror will never be fought by guns and whatever, military tactics that are employed. And we have enough data to prove this. So I just want to emphasize two things. Scientifically, we kind of understand what is terrorism and what are the push factors. Now, as relates to the Uganda situation, some quarters believe that the push factors in the terror attacks in Uganda are caused by the law enforcement, the detention, the violence and the prolonged detention by law enforcement officers in that country. But I think one emphasis is placed on what I spoke about, this so-called mutual legal assistance. International and regional counter-terrorism cooperation is key to respond to such to this problem. I think if these strategies take place, we will be successful in countering violent extremism and bring society to probably a level where we see fewer and fewer of these types of incidents. But again, the war on terror cannot be fought by guns and weapons.
All right. So I want us to just wind up on that as well when we're talking about the war on terror, so that we can go to what is happening in South Sudan. Not really South Sudan, but Sudan itself, just following the war and the latest development there, where we have the international donors who have pledged $1.5 billion shillings for Sudan. That is what we want to also just gravitate on. And also the UN chief, Guterres, warning of conflicts escalating. So I just want to brief you on that, unless now we have any other issue on the al-Shabab, Dr. Kanenje, right? I think we've exhausted that. Let's go to Sudan unrest. And we have the UN Supremo, Antonio Guterres, who on Monday painted a grim picture of Sudan's future as a breeding ground for further conflict and strife in Africa during a conference to raise money for humanitarian relief efforts in the country. According to the General Secretary, without strong international support, Sudan could quickly become a locus of lawlessness, radiating insecurity across the region. Organizers of International Donors Conference for Sudan said they also wanted to find ways to encourage a more efficient ceasefire between the warring factions. Guterres concluded that the only way to end the crisis was through a return to peace and restoration of civilian rule via transition to democracy. The pledging event was also co-organized by the UN's humanitarian and the refugee agencies alongside Egypt, Germany, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, plus African Union and European Union. And momentarily, of course, we shall just get the bite from the UN Secretary General himself. But I wanted also to move on full steam ahead with the latest development from there, where we're given to understand as well that Sudan has rejected William Ruto's lead role in IGAD mediation. But we can speak to this particular international donor pledge and the UN Chief Guterres' warning of conflicts escalating. Will he see that continuing apace? Let's just begin with you, Dr. Kanenje.
The current pledge, of course, is encouraging, especially considering the humanitarian situation that is ongoing in Sudan. But number one, there are two questions about it. To what extent is it going to be realized? One of the things we have seen when it comes to pledges in trying to assist, solve African problems, is the response is not normally as quick as the response we are seeing when it comes to pledges over Ukraine, situation. So probably I can bait by the end of this year we will not still be having the 1.4 billion that has been, pledged. It's probably going only to be a fraction of that, and so I'm not exactly too excited. While that can provide much hope for some relief, I'm not too excited about those pledges alone. Number two, those pledges cannot have any impact without a long-lasting ceasefire and a path towards resolution of the conflict. Today, you can hardly fly into Khartoum because the airport, of course, is under fire. And one thing that I think we've not been focusing a lot more is ensuring that beyond the humanitarian efforts being undertaken, that actually a very solid substantive framework of intervention is arrived at. Now, the experiments of the Saudi American plan, while it managed to extract some commitments with regard to ceasefire, which was regularly being violated, it's not sustainable. Now, the IGAD framework, of course, supported by the AU, probably was going to be the only, realistic, framework that parties can agree to. The challenge is right now, some parties within Sudan, of course, they are having reservations with regard to Nairobi's role. And some of it is based on allegations that are unfounded, but some of it is, is based on perhaps the perception that perhaps Kenya might not have been, might not be the most neutral actor. And now some of the statements that our own officials sometimes, both, in government and outside, have said, of course, betrays, our sense of neutrality because of the manner in which we've caricatured, the conflict in Sudan. And perhaps we should do a better job in convincing the Sudanese, people that we're going to be an honest broker, because no other country can better actually lead this process than Kenya at this stage, but we have to do a better job. And so, at the same time, it's going to be important that we mobilize the international community and the continent to have a common approach. What we've been seeing is competing approaches, and that is why we actually do not have anything sustainable. You're going to need a united approach led by regional institutions, by also supported by international actors to ensure that you don't have spoilers. Remember, Sudan is a theater of geopolitics also. And so to the extent that we may think our interventions as a region is going to be sufficient, we'll be lying to ourselves. We also need to find mechanisms of getting support from international players, but also holding them to account in case they're going to play a spoiler role inside Sudan.
Thank you. All right, I just want us to get the context of where the UN Secretary General was talking about, especially with this donor pledge. Let's just listen in.
International donors pledged close to $1.5 billion in humanitarian aid for Sudan and the broader region on Monday. That's roughly half the $3 billion the UN says is needed. Secretary General Antonio Guterres sounded the alarm on the conflict the same day.
I am particularly concerned by reports of gender-based and sexual violence and by the ethnic dimension of the violence in Geneina. Targeted attacks against civilians based on their ethnic identities could amount to crimes against humanity.
Among the biggest donors, Germany, the US, and Qatar. The UN says it's setting aside another $22 million for the most urgent needs. The war between Sudan's army and the paramilitary rapid support forces began in mid-April. It sparked amid ongoing tensions over an internationally backed plan for a transition towards elections under a civilian government. The conflict has left more than 3,000 people dead, turned the capital Khartoum into a war zone, and triggered deadly violence in other parts of the country, including the western region of Darfur. International donors pledged close to $1.5 billion in humanitarian aid for Sudan and the broader...
That was the context. Let's just continue. Peter Kagwanja.
Now, the pledge has been used internationally as an instrument of raising the profile of an intervention or a case going on. We saw it in South Sudan, and we've seen it in many other areas where it could be Ethiopia during the Tigray War. Just the UN uses the pledges as an instrument. Whether it is realized at the end of the day, the amount of money which has been pledged usually don't come, or it comes in trickles, not in downpour. So as a result, we need to understand it simply that way, that this is more of a diplomatic intervention rather than a financial intervention. I think the UN and Africa need to invest more in understanding the complexity of this conflict. Because it's always business as usual that you take this liberal piece, let the protagonist come down the table and then talk and so on. In Sudan, who is talking with who? Because we have a three-layered conflict that is going on. It all started with Omar al-Bashir being dethroned. And as a result of very, very prolonged public protests by the civilians who are unhappy with the leadership of Bashir. And with that, therefore, we had something similar to a coup, but which had the backing of the civilians in a certain way, what we call a civilian coup against Omar al-Bashir. Now, Africa intervened, and we have this transition, government, which is supposed to move from the military to the civilian. As when we are in the final year of the implementation of civilian rule, the army takes power, right? Then, and it is supported by the rapid response force, this one of Hemedti. And Hemedti himself becomes the second in command after the army, meaning the Janjaweed force is more or less legitimized as a stakeholder in this power sharing, what now the government is trying to call EBOS. Then finally, we have the fallout between the two arms of the military. At a time when the civilians are calling for the return to the transition, which would have led to the civilian rule. So, and when therefore the wars broke out, the civilians were already in the streets fighting against the military and the rebels alike, and requiring or calling for the return of military, civilian rule. Now, so when you say, let's sit down and talk, who is sitting down and talking? Abdallah Hamdok, to the best of my knowledge, is still somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere else in Africa. So, and he was the legitimate civilian leader who was appointed but toppled by the military. Why? Because he questioned the role of Burhani and his colleagues in controlling the economy. They own banks, they own mines, they control land. The military is the alpha and the omega of the economy in the Sudan. And that brings the complexity of this kind of a war. So the United Nations, the African Union, and IGAD should first of all understand the complexity of this conflict in Sudan. It is like no other that we have ever experienced in Africa. The closest we came to this was in Egypt, when al-Sisi was the military commander, and then he took power and removed the civilian leader. But in Sudan, in Egypt, we didn't have a militia like the one we have in this rapid response force. If we don't understand this complexity, the liberal approach to peacemaking will not work in Sudan. Now, the other point to make on top of this is the nature of our regional response. Now, remember, IGAD has provided the regional architecture of security or rather intervention in this conflict. But for the better part of the last 5 years, from April, if we must say, 2018, to now the recent meeting in Djibouti, IGAD was to all intents and purposes dead. So the first thing that we needed to first do is to do an assessment of IGAD as a body that can intervene credibly in Sudan. Ironically, the Sudan that we are now supposed to be intervening in is the chair of IGAD. You know, that's a paradox. It's the chair of IGAD. And why was this the chair of IGAD? Because it had a civilian leader who was Abdallah Hamdok, who was toppled. So to all intents and purposes, IGAD was toppled in Sudan. So it has no mandate or legitimacy in that country. And Sudan is the chair. Now, when we come to the African Union, is suspicious. Has been here and there used by certain leaders to hide. In Ethiopia, the African Union was basically used as a cover because IGAD is not allowed to intervene in Ethiopia. And therefore, the peace deal in Ethiopia did not take the form of IGAD. It was the African Union. And we must also look into the role of Gulf states in this conflict. You might underrate the spillover effects of the geopolitics of the Gulf and the Middle East, and they're the ones shaping dynamics in Sudan. So you can get these people sitting down and talking, but have you first talked to Qatar? Have you talked to the UAE? Have you talked to Saudi Arabia? Have you brought Egypt on board? Have you talked to Turkey, which is one of the most powerful military forces now on the Horn, if you must look at it that way. So it's a complex region. It's not about Kenya. It's not about Ethiopia. It's not about South Sudan, the quartet.
Yes.
The quartet might get itself trapped in a very murky complex of regional geopolitics. And I think that's where we are. But first and foremost, can we reconstruct IGAD as a force? Because it was to all intents and purposes dead. Now, are we bringing it back? Thanks God, Eritrea is back in the IGAD. And that shows good signs for its rise. But have we dealt with the Horn of Africa, what we're calling Horn of Africa alliance? Are we done with it? Or is IGAD involved in its own internal conflict and machinations that that we have seen in the past?
Thank you. Let's hear from Ahmed Hashi.
Well, Deval, thank you for noticing me. I want to use the slogan used by the Sudanese revolution, and it was called Taskut Bas, which meant fall, just fall. We should never lose sight of the history of the Sudan. In the last show, I correctly predicted there was going to be a humanitarian catastrophe in the Sudan and its neighboring countries, and that has spilled over to Chad, where there's nearly 2 million refugees who have gone in. It's already destabilizing Chad. And I said that there's about 10 countries in the Sahel that are going to face state crisis over this issue of the Sudan. I also said that the Gulf countries were the ones, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are the ones who are destabilizing Sudan. The UAE is now the chairman of the Security Council in the UN this month. It has invited Somalia to come to try and kill the arms embargo. The disproportionate interest of the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia in the Horn and in this region must stop. About the great Botswana novelist called Bessie Head said that discipline is irreverence for the people. Now, Mr. Hamedi came to Kenya and saw President Uhuru. Someone at Foreign Affairs was sleeping at the job when we invited that man to come to this country. And the reason why they were sleeping at their job is because they did not have an early warning system, a special envoy, or the intellectual diplomatic ideas of understanding that there was a coup in Sudan, and we don't invite people who do coups in Africa to our country. That is the position of the Foreign Affairs Department for a very long time. Now, today Sudan has rejected Kenya's leadership in this committee.
Yeah, we'll come to that. I just wanted to run it by you. Will you comment just on the UN first so that I can go to it?
Okay, so the thing is that the UN Secretary General's plea is going to fall because the early warning systems that we in Kenya I've always argued, and this panel has always argued, was not there. The UN is right in bringing this thing up. The UN Security Council is under the UAE this month. The UAE is a direct player in the Sudan. International relations is going topsy-turvy. That is why we Africans have to capture the mantle of our diplomacy and reject these isms that have come to us, because it's costing us, Debal, an incredible amount of pain and suffering in this region. And it is not that we don't know, we know, but we don't have the political will to stand up for certain principles in this region. And if we don't stand up for certain principles in this region, the international community is going to put a noose around our neck, and we'll be struggling for a long time.
Thank you, Hashi. Now, let's just follow up on what Hashi was teasing, and this is about the rejection of President William Ruto's lead role in IGAD mediation, where we understand that they are saying that President William Ruto has, for the first time, spoken about the rejection to lead peace talks in Sudan. And this was in a statement. On Tuesday, he asked warring parties in Sudan to allow humanitarian agencies to operate freely. He was speaking when he met the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who briefed him on the humanitarian and refugee crisis in Sudan. We know that last week Sudan rejected the appointment of President Ruto as head of a quartet to facilitate peace under the regional bloc intergovernmental authority on development, that is IGAD. Sudan's Army General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan opposed Ruto's chairmanship, stating that Kenya is not neutral and continues to harbor leaders of the Rapid Support Forces, rebels. Kenya was elected as chair of the IGAD quartet to resolve issues in Sudan on June 12, 2023 in Djibouti. Other countries in the quartet include Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. Sudan has also rejected the IGAD mediation schedule, which will have seen Ruto arrange for a face-to-face meeting for the first time between the two warring generals. However, on Tuesday, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi told President Ruto that the situation has escalated and the number of refugees fleeing the war is expected to hit the 2 million mark. And we've heard that also from the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres about the escalation of this warring factions. So what does it really portend Because we've heard that from government, they are going full steam ahead with the decision and the schedule for them to meet face to face. But if one side of the faction seems to actually see or have the perception that the land is not neutral and they have umbrage with that, should they go full steam ahead and say they will meet and go with the schedule? You are actually on it.
So, Debal, thank you for giving me a chance to speak about that. I appreciate it. There is something very wrong, Debal, and my nose is smelling something that is not good at Foreign Affairs. Who allowed Mr. Hemedi to come to this country to meet Mr. Ruto? Was it the Office of the President or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Especially since there was a conflict in Sudan and everybody knew that it was brewing. And we know that the president of Mr. Burhan, according to sources, allegedly, was opposed to this vice president coming to Nairobi. And you know, the South Sudanese have been attacked or in the public record and in Human Rights Watch for having lots of financial resources being brought to this country, where there's a lot of money laundering in Nairobi. It is very possible that some of these issues that the Sudanese government in South Sudan and the one in North Sudan have been trying to play us here in Nairobi on issues of corruption, especially since Mr. Hemedi was controlling a gold mine in Sudan. Debal, I put it to you that someone in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Office of the President really dropped the ball on this issue. And now it is brought to disrepute. President Ruto's negotiation chair. And I think that there has to be an urgent call on this thing. I mean, Debal, I worked there and I know how these things work. It is very, 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 very tragic that the president of Sudan has said this. He has not given us a reason for it. I'm sure he's watching his mouth. But I think President Ruto either dropped the ball himself or someone at the Foreign Affairs dropped the ball. And this is a very serious thing because the lives of the Sudanese people matter and the intervention of IGAD matters. And if someone dropped the ball on this issue, but I put it to you, it's a very serious issue.
All right. Do you hold with the view that that is emanating from that particular diplomatic faux pas that we had? And we had the vice president coming, and there was no brief on the other party that was showing up for that particular meeting. Do you think it's what is necessitating for the other party to say that no, we'll not come because this is not neutrality? Or there's a bigger underlying issue regarding this particular rejection?
I think it is not coming from a single.
It's not coming.
It's not coming from
there's a confluence of issues.
It's a confluence of issues. One of it has to do with, I think, the way generally we've been characterizing the conflict in Sudan. And the generals there, they've not exactly been extremely happy because we've not been characterized in a very respectful way. Two, has to do with, we have a lot of loose cannons in our country. And people have made all sorts of statements with regard to the conflict in Sudan, how we should go about it, who have no business actually mentioning anything because you're neither from the Office of the President nor from Foreign Affairs, but then they're still commenting on those issues. The other country, remember, takes certain things very seriously. You could be Minister of Oil or whatever it is, but when you say something, because you're part of government, then they're going to hold that against your country. But thirdly, with regard to Hemedi's presence in Kenya, engaging parties in Sudan is not criminal. It is the manner in which we seek to engage them. Anytime you're engaging parties to a conflict, it's always important to appear to be neutral. And so if we're going to invite one, let's then invite the other. For us, you remember how we played our good hand with regard to the conflict in Ethiopia. It allowed us for both parties to have a degree of confidence in Kenya to be able to mediate that conflict. And we should learn from some of these success stories we've done. Same with the CPA, Comprehensive Peace Agreement, from 2011. And so we've not been, I think, very, structured in the way we're actually engaging Sudan. And one thing we're going to need to start doing is have track 2 diplomacy, then track 1.5 diplomacy, to start actually having emissaries, to start using some people who have familiarity with the parties, whether they're ex-diplomats or ex-senior military people, to ensure we build the kind of relationship that is going to build confidence in Kenya's capacity to be able to be neutral mediator or actor.
Thank you. Dr. Kanenje will continue with your thought on the other side of a break. My music is up, indicating that I should be taking a station break right now. When we continue, we'll look, of course, on this particular issue, delving